Thank you very much. I'd like to answer your question before I start my talk. So your question was, what is the cost of radiological protection in relation to other costs? My question back to you is, what is the cost of not doing it? So I'm going to just start with that. So I'm a bit unusual in this situation. I admit I am not an expert on radiological protection, so if I get some things wrong, please be gentle with me and come and tell me so that I can learn from you and so that you can learn about the ethics from me as well. My first thing though is I have a disclaimer because I work for a number of organisations, so these are my views and not the views of the organisations that I work for. I'm in a really weird situation, I have to say today. I am obviously an officer in the Air Force. I work as a chaplain. I also work as an ethicist for UNSW Canberra Space and some other organisations. Next year, I will be the ethicist for the Air Force, so I'm kind of not sure which hat I've got on today, but I absolutely will state that my views are my own. Very excited that next year the Air Force will be putting me on, changing my role to be a full-time space ethicist. Means there will be 2 full-time space ethicists in the world, one with the French space agency Jacques Arnaud, which some of you may know, and myself, so it's an exciting time. So, space ethics. What is space ethics? My first thing that I need to say is, for those of you who are involved in space or in radiological protection, can I ask you to, if you have ever had to put in an application to an ethics committee or an international review board, can you raise your hand? Leave your hand up if you had a problem. I apologise profusely. This is not that kind of ethics, is what I want to start with. So that is obviously very important ethical issues, looking at vulnerable populations and how we protect them within the research programs that we do. And so often ethics committees get a really bad rap, sometimes because they cause all sorts of problems for smaller reasons, but this is a very different area of ethics. I do work in that area of ethics as well, but today we're actually looking at the big picture stuff. So what is space ethics? I love telling the story of a 14-year-old girl who said to me, space ethicist, is that like a real job? And I'd just like to say, it is a real job. So what I look at is looking at the ethical implications of various different issues that happen in space, in the space industry, and also in allied kind of professions as well. My goal today is to turn all of you into space ethicists or radiological protection ethicists, in that I want you to take away from this to be thinking about the ethical implications of your work and also potentially the ethical implications maybe of some of the research that we all consume and look at. So I am actually a military space ethicist, which is even a smaller subset. And so my research particularly looks at things like the problems of space debris and space terrorism. So what I'm talking about today is in broad general terms and not related to my own particular research, but if you want to Google me, go for it. So space ethics is very similar in lots of ways to other roles within the space, and I'm going to say industry for want of a better word, the space area. So realistically, the job of a space ethicist or an ethicist in general is to look at potential problems. So they're looking at risks and looking at ways that we can mitigate those risks. And so hence today I'm going to be talking about ethical issues in relation to radiological protection in space. And I'm specifically going to be thinking about Mars because today is the Mars Day. With that broad overview, let's have a look. So, radiological protection and travelling in space in general. So put your hand up, and I've asked this at a number of different places, put your hand up if you would really love to travel to space. I'm going to put 2 hands up because that would be awesome. I think the chances of them sending an ethicist to space are quite slim, but I put my hand up first as volunteering for that. What about those of you who'd like to travel to Mars? people here who'd like to travel to Mars? I'll get you to put your hands down. I asked this question a few years ago. There was a really great conference. I think it was called Future Leaders of Space, but it was effectively young leaders because they were all younger people. And I asked the same question, and they all put their hand up, and a number of them put 2 hands up. And I said, okay, so who wants to travel to Mars? And they all put their hands up. And I went, okay, what about if I told you it would make you sick? And some of the hands went down. And I said, what about if I told you it's a one-way trip? You're not coming back. And a couple of them kept their hands up, and I went, okay, obviously I'm not being clear enough. What about if I told you when you got to Mars you'd be really sick with radiation sickness and you'd die a painful, horrible death crawling around on Mars? So people still had their hands up. And so what it actually raises for me is, what is an acceptable amount of risk? What's an acceptable amount of risk for me as a 50-year-old woman will be different to what is an acceptable risk to a hugely adventurous 21-year-old woman. And so it's hard to gauge what is acceptable in terms of risk. So it leads to a whole heap of questions about what we know. So we currently know a reasonable amount about travelling to space. We know that rockets blow up. We know that there are concerns about decompression, about lack of oxygen, about too much carbon dioxide, there are a whole heap of things we do know. There are some things we obviously are learning about radiological protection, but there is an enormous amount that we don't know. We are still learning. 50 years after we placed a person on the moon, we're still working stuff out. And some of you may have recently seen, there was a study that came out of KBR. I tried to give Mark credit for this, but he very kindly said that was some of his colleagues, which looked at they did ultrasounds and looked at the blood flow in the, I'm going to say, internal jugular vein, and found that in some astronauts it's actually flowing backwards because of the microgravity, and that is actually causing clots. Now, the reason I raise this is because we are still learning even now. There's a lot that we have yet to learn, for example, about the radiological effect on astronauts on their reproductive organs, and in fact on all of the organs. And part of the reason for this is because we don't want to conduct autopsies on our astronauts after they land. We want them to have life after space, and so we can't go in and do in-depth research straight away. So it's 50 years. One of the other thing is, we know quite a lot about going to space, but what about the unintended consequences of travelling in space and effects of radiation? So that leads the question of, how can an astronaut, so here we have Sally Ride on this side, who was the first American female astronaut in space, not the first female, the first American female astronaut in space. How can astronauts give informed consent to actually be able to take part in space research on themselves? We also have a photo here of Dennis Tito, who was the first space tourist. Now, someone like Sally Ride, who has done years of postgraduate study and then years of study to become an astronaut and training, is obviously going to be much more informed than someone who has done a short stint in training as a space tourist. Yet we kind of expect them to kind of make the same sort of decisions about potentially about their time in space and research that might be done on them. So, which leads to the question about valid consent. So some of you may have studied this at medical school. It's often referred to as informed consent, but the informed part is actually a part of valid consent. So for something to be consented to, in order to it be valid, it has 3 main areas. The person has to be mentally competent, and I would argue that all our astronauts and potentially all of our space tourists are capable of making a decision. They have mental competency. although being strapped to a rocket sounds very scary, but I think they're perfectly capable of making decisions. The second question is they can't be coerced. So if I hold a gun to your head and get you to sign a contract, that is actually a coerced situation and it's not valid anymore. Part of the problem, although, is around if somebody refuses to sign a consent form, then we tell them they can't go into space, I assume. If that is incorrect, come and talk to me about it afterwards. But it raises questions around whether we have actually coerced them. And the final thing is that they obviously need to be fully informed of what the risks are, but we just don't know what those risks are. So it puts astronauts and space tourists in a very interesting position in being able to give consent to travel into space and to actually have medical experimentation done on them. Now, I'd just like to say a waiver. Please don't get upset until I say this. There are some occupations who actually waive quite a lot of their rights in order to do their job. My job is one of them. I am an Air Force officer, and so I have waived certain rights in order that I can actually do my job. And I do that willingly when I actually enlist into the Air Force. In a similar way, astronauts are doing a similar thing. They're actually weighing the risk of being able to put those rights to one side in order to do something that is truly amazing. So I want you to consider that when we think about consent around astronauts. Space tourists, a whole heap of extra kind of problems which we can talk about at another time. Now, I'm not sure if it was the same gentleman who asked about the cost, but I noticed on the app, which I agree is excellent, there was a question about why don't we send convicts to Mars as volunteers for space missions. So I'm just going to address that one straight off the bat. My first question is, do you really want people who are convicts to be in charge of our research and deep space? Well, not necessarily even deep space. Do you really want to put them in an enclosed environment with other people to make team decisions? That concerns me greatly. The second thing is, why the suggestion of convicts? It actually raises a really good question. Is it because the person who phrased this, and I'm sorry if I'm outing you to everybody, is it because you think that they deserve to die more than other people, or maybe they deserve to suffer more than other people, or is it because they've lost the right to be considered an equal person because of their conviction? I'd just like to say it's problematic when we start considering people in certain categories as having not giving up rights, not because they voluntarily give up rights, but I think it's a slippery slope. So I'd just like to put that out there. So, future generations. So, what about if our space travellers that are going to Mars are actually able to be shielded? We have a lot of the technology to actually send people to Mars already. The number one thing that's letting the team down, to be quite honest, is us. It's our human bodies. But what about if we can protect people so that they're actually 99% protected and they're going to come back almost as healthy, but not quite, almost as healthy as when we sent them. But there will be a few changes, let's say epigenetic changes to them. What are one of the unintended consequences in the long term is we could actually be potentially changing their germline. We could be potentially changing the genetics of their children, their grandchildren, and future generations. Which raises a question. Do we, as the people who are making decisions and sending people to Mars now, do we have a duty to future generations? Or is our only duty to the astronauts? Is our only duty to, if I'm a commercial operator, is my only duty to my shareholders? I would say no, but obviously I'm an ethicist, so I'm going to say that. But it raises questions for us. So, an analogy actually that is interesting in this area is looking at the climate crisis. Do we have a duty to future generations in regards to the climate? And I would argue that we do. So therefore, do we also have a duty to future generations about potential germline changes? And so I don't have a full answer for that, but what I am putting this forward for is so that we can actually start to consider what some of the longer term risks might be, so that people smarter than me can actually think about ways of mitigating those risks. Okay, so 6 years ago when I started working in space ethics, I vowed I would never talk about aliens, and today I'm about to blow that out of the water. If you are here from a television station or a newspaper, please do not talk about me talking about alien ethics, because that's not what this is. I can just say it now, explaining that to my boss. So, say we actually, say our presence or how we protect humans from radiological harm has unintended consequences not on us, but on developing life forms. So say that what we are doing to protect us actually in some way diminishes their opportunity to grow and develop. So we're limiting their evolution chances, for example. The question is, do we have a duty to ensure that we do no harm not only on Earth, but also to developing life forms potentially elsewhere? So that's a question I leave with you. So, because I'm an ethicist, we've just got to go to the extreme, really. So, do we have a duty to advanced life forms? There were lots, don't Google alien life forms, you get all sorts of weird things. So my question is, with regards to, say, let's talk about our radiological protection as well as other parts of our space travel, do we have to consider unintended consequences on harming advanced life forms? Now, at this stage, I'm being very clear, we have not had any contact with any other extraterrestrial life. I know nothing that you guys don't know. But say this is it is a potential. Say it's a potential. Do we have a duty only to humans, or do we have a duty to these life forms as well? Say we send people to Mars and we colonise Mars and they have children, do we only have a duty to humans who are born on Earth? Do we have a duty to the people who are born on Mars? Even if we consider that we don't have a duty to advanced life forms, my question then is, what about being pragmatic? Because I'm a military ethicist and my job is to have more peace in the world. Being pragmatic, do we want to consider that potentially causing unintended harm to advanced life forms might actually cause problems for us in the long run, either diplomatically or militarily? So maybe we need to consider that. And I would suggest that there are some very clever astrobiologists who could actually kind of talk more to this than me. Which comes to my final point, which is I'd encourage you, when I teach space ethics or military ethics or any kind of ethics really, what I encourage my students to think is to think about all the things that could possibly go wrong. I'm generally a very happy, positive person in my life, but my job is to think of all of the things that could potentially go wrong. So I encourage my students to actually think like an evil genius and think about all the ways that things could possibly go wrong so that we can mitigate those risks, not only to us, but to future generations and potentially to other people who are affected by future problems in regards to space, in regards to radiological protection and so forth. I invite you to similarly start to think about the ethical considerations around your own work and around the work of radiological protection and travelling to space. And with that, I'm going to leave us with Elon Musk, because he's just the gift that keeps on giving in regards to space ethics, and leave the floor open to questions.
All right, thank you, Nikki. It's been an interesting range of comments on the app. All right, so In a financially and resource constrained world,
Yep.
we really need to look at relative cost and reduce the cost burden from over-regulation due to over-conservative precaution.
Is that a question? Is my first?
It's a statement, I suppose. It's,
I can speak to that if you want. Yes, we do need to balance, and I agree entirely, we need to balance over-regulation as opposed to encouraging free market approaches. But I think that there are some costs that we need to weigh up that aren't financial, and causing potential problems to future generations is one of them. I think our current climate situation is a result of us not thinking more closely about long-term unintended consequences and only focusing on the short-term financial constraints. But it's not an and/or, we can do both.
Okay, another question. What are your thoughts on pollution of other planets from our actions?
Oh yes, I was here 2 years ago when Elon Musk was talking about, well, we'll just go pollute Mars and that will actually rearrange things and be better for us. I think when we're looking at duties, we have a duty to, we have hierarchies of duties. So I have a duty to my family, I have a duty to my kids, I have a duty to my country, I have a duty to the world. I also have a duty to other life forms, for want of a better term. And so I think it's about weighing the two against each other. I think we've done a bang-up job of polluting this world, so I'd be concerned about us thinking that we could actually get it under control on another planet. So that would be my concern.
Okay, thank you. I'll just open up to the floor if anybody has one last question before we move on to our third presenter. No? Okay, well, thank you, Nikki.